Welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing how to move from traditional warehouse management to fulfillment optimization. My name is Robbie Cluett, Director of Customer Success for Syncontex Supply Chain, and I'm joined here with Hector Rodrosco, President and CEO of Syncontex Supply Chain. Let me begin with sharing a little bit about ourselves. Syncontex is a firm specialized in fulfillment optimization. Our solutions and expertise in this area combine advanced technologies with years of first-hand experience overseeing distribution operations, leading distribution center design and optimization projects throughout the world, and collaborating with leading industry associations to help hundreds of distribution facilities uncover improvement opportunities in their own operations. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing some of the blind spots that exist in today's widely adopted management systems. We're going to be reviewing some visible symptoms and not so visible sources of waste. We're going to be highlighting some key differences between data and intelligence. We're going to be providing some actual best practices on how you can move your mindset from management to optimization. We're going to be briefly introducing optimization systems, the new normal in warehousing technology. And of course, throughout the webinar, you'll find a lot of practical tips and insights derived from numerous productivity benchmarking studies that we have completed with leading retailers and wholesalers from all over the country. Throughout the webinar, we'll be here live to answer any questions you may have, and we'll also stick around after for a live Q&A and discussion through the event chat. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we're here today to discuss a fundamental shift in traditional warehousing and order fulfillment, and that's a shift from warehouse management to fulfillment optimization. It may take many forms depending on the operation, but the origin and reason for the shift is simple. Despite management systems being widely adopted in the fulfillment operation of today, waste still exists. When we talk about waste, we're talking about wasted margin, wasted movement, wasted time, wasted space, and wasted product. And this is regardless of the shape or size of the operation or the industry or sector. The problem is that while most executives and operators know a certain level of waste exists within their operations, it's not always obvious how much or even where this waste exists. And if you don't know where to look or how much opportunity is available, it's hard to prioritize amongst typical day-to-day tasks. Without the right tools, most waste will never be obvious to the naked eye. And no, although we've seen some creative work in our day, a spreadsheet is not the best optimization tool. There are, however, some clear and visible symptoms that executives and operators can look out for that could point to an inefficient process below the surface. Let's review. One of the biggest and most visible symptoms of waste in a conventional distribution operation is decreasing selection productivity and a resulting increase in order selection cost. There are a few things that can cause this, of course, but oftentimes the underlying or invisible cause is excess selection travel. Order selection is responsible for over 50% of your direct labor costs. Travel is a big component of it, and a good portion of it is often unnecessary. When it comes to a noticeable decrease in forklift productivity and resulting increase in forklift costs, oftentimes the invisible cause is not having enough product available on the floor for picking. This requires excess pallet letdowns and forklift travel, especially if reserve inventory is located far from the item's pick slot. Cluttered staging areas make for an extremely visible queue. The cluttered dock or staging area being blocked by pallets usually points to poor capacity utilization, causing a perceived lack of operating capacity. Not only can this significantly slow inbound productivity and potentially affect product availability, but it can also cause an unsafe working environment. An increase in breakdown costs during receiving oftentimes is caused by inadequate pallet configurations and suboptimal pallet heights, requiring additional direct labor and slowing the inbound process. Low open slot availability is a visible cue that points to the inability to consistently evaluate pick slot utilization. The less visible result of this typically is poor utilization of prime storage areas and even a perceived lack of pick slot capacity. Whether you are managing an automated pick module, ASRS, or just a high velocity pick zone with conventional racking, Underutilization or mismanagement of these areas can result in disorganization, low productivity levels, and ultimately wasted time and investment dollars. And finally, seasonal peaks and lulls. SKU proliferation and handling promotional items can not only wreak havoc on facility capacity, but can negatively impact labor productivity in a big way if not forecasted and managed properly and consistently. A big reason why many of these visible symptoms and not so visible underlying causes exist and persist is that in the absence of proper tools, most operators are forced to make decisions based on experience and gut feeling. As a result, symptoms such as the ones I just mentioned either go unnoticed or the connection is never made between the visible and the invisible. Ultimately, the waste is chalked up usually to the cost of doing business. I want to take a step back and add some context to this. With our solutions, which are based on the concepts we're discussing here today, we've uncovered over $33 million in yearly savings for our clients. It's not meant to be a sales pitch, but I want to illustrate the price that a lot of organizations are needlessly paying each and every year. When we say waste, we're not just talking about a spilled cup of coffee. For the next part, I'm going to hand it over to Hector.
Thank you, Robbie. One of the biggest reasons waste, even at this magnitude, is missed is primarily because the management systems that are so widely adopted today, by design, maintain the status quo. And if there's one thing we know about the status quo, is that it usually ensures a slow but steady decline in efficiency. Traditional management systems provide functionality to help you run the operation. They help you maintain the status quo instead of allowing you to question it. Now, why does efficiency typically degrade steadily over time? Well, most distribution operations are dynamic in nature. Ongoing SKU proliferation, seasonal and sporadic demand, fluctuation in inventory levels, year-over-year business growth, to name a few variables, all have a direct impact on direct labor requirements, item slotting, capacity utilization, and ultimately overall efficiency. To further illustrate this point, we don't have to look further than the effect COVID-19 had on the retail sector. If you were in grocery or providing any other essential goods, you likely saw an exponential rise in product demand, mostly from a small list of staple items. And because of this, you were likely dealing with a shortage in direct labor. What this meant was, although sales were up, so was overtime and overall labor span. Operations that were unable to adapt quickly and scale throughput in an efficient way, so their margins shrink as a result. On the other side of the coin, those providing non-essentials, as a result of retail store closures, saw an exponential increase in e-commerce demand, which meant smaller order sizes, an increase in order frequency, a shift in storage requirements, and a shift in labor requirements. Like those dealing with essential goods, existing inefficiencies were highlighted and exaggerated. Each order shipped became more expensive and, with throughput compromised by bottlenecks, order turnaround times increased. Aside from being able to effectively capture some retail demand through their e-commerce channels, those that survived the past few months and continue to survive through these difficult times all have a few things in common. They made decisions quickly. They adapted layouts and equipment to smaller and more frequent orders. They increased and optimized throughput capacity. And finally, and most importantly, they saw an opportunity to move away from the status quo. On the topic of throughput, not too long ago, we conducted a nationwide warehouse productivity study with ROFDA and FMI, two well-known associations in the grocery industry, and it uncovered a stark contrast between those in the top 10% in direct labor productivity and those that were amongst the average. Those in the top 10% were 30% more productive than the average. This means that not only are they able to ship the same volume for less, but in times like this, they can ship 30% more at the same efficiency. Now let's talk about the difference between data and intelligence. When moving from warehouse management to optimization, you'll realize that there's a big difference and it's not always obvious. Data provides information, whereas intelligence provides perspective, context, and guidance. When you have a fresh perspective, you can begin to view your operation differently and ask the right questions as to why you operate the way you do. Starting with the layout. When it comes to aisle width, there are generally three configurations: narrow and very narrow at 10'6" and 6 feet respectively. And then you have conventional, which is typically 12.5 to 13 feet. As aisle width should be based primarily on equipment and storage requirements, understanding these factors can have a big impact on capacity utilization and on direct labor productivity. With respect to very narrow aisle, for example, results from one of our previous warehouse productivity studies show that while VNA typically results in 21% less productivity, the average operator using it can ship 50% more volume in 2/3 of the space of those who don't have it. For these operators, CapEx avoidance can offset productivity losses. The key to avoid turning a VNA area into a bottleneck lies in the items being stored within those aisles. If not set up properly and maintained properly, a very narrow aisle setup can become a major drain in productivity. Another important aspect of an operations layout is how pick breaks or selection zones are configured. An operation can typically control order sizes, but it can control how its pallets are put together. Now, a typical pallet, depending on system configuration, safely holds between 60 and 75 cube. If pick breaks and item sequencing are not set up properly to maximize pallet cube and maintained consistently throughout the year, it can cause wasted selection travel and excess pallet consolidation on the dock. Now, in order to ensure optimal pick breaks, you can start with these best practices. Look for opportunities to combine or eliminate unnecessary pick breaks whenever possible. Ensure items are slotted in proper stackability and crushability sequence to avoid product damage and rework. Maintain optimal item slotting to ensure enough product is on the floor and available for picking. Order commonality is also a very important consideration for a lot of distribution environments and can provide an effective method of reducing selection travel for certain orders, especially if items are being shipped to multiple customer profiles. To illustrate the impact of assessing commonality in practice, a recent order commonality analysis that we conducted as part of a strategic opportunity assessment revealed that only 1/3 of an existing warehousing space is required for the selection of items belonging to a unique customer type. This meant most of the orders that belong to this specific customer type could bypass the majority of the warehouse using commonality-based selection paths, resulting in millions of dollars in yearly net savings for the distribution network from reduced selection travel. This is an important example, not just because of how much net savings were discovered, but it shows that you don't always need to invest in new equipment or automation to discover and realize savings. Sometimes you just need the right information. We are a big proponent of automation, but it's not always the obvious next step when it comes to continuous improvement. Now, when it comes to the fixed material handling equipment that make up your layout, productivity differences in the equipment chosen can be significant. We already talked about very narrow aisle and the hand stack locations that would be used within them. But let's take a look at some more conventional options. This data was also taken from our last warehouse productivity study, showing the forklift productivity difference between conventional single deep, double deep, drive-in, and pushback racking. Now, In this case, we see that productivity gains from pushback racking can offset the investment required. But this is only if they're utilized correctly and the productivity versus space trade-off is properly analyzed. In order to maximize productivity, it's critical to understand the quantity of equipment required and how it should be distributed throughout the layout. For example, utilizing pushback racking in an area meant to house slower moving items may help reduce pick slot replenishments, but the additional selection travel that you add to your layout is sure to cancel out the benefit and more. When we talk about equipment, like I mentioned, it needs to be considered that there is always a balance between capacity utilization and direct labor productivity. There are trade-offs among your direct labor functions, including fingerprinting, pallet put away, replenishment, and of course selection travel, that are involved in all material handling decisions, and they can sometimes be a lot more substantial than you think. Let's review an example using weekly replenishments and put away tasks versus order selection travel time. In an average distribution operation, there are things that can be evaluated easily by the naked eye, and then there are things that are either not so obvious or downright impossible to track without the right tools. Pick slot replenishment is relatively easy to track from a data standpoint and from physically seeing them happen on the floor. This is why the average operator most of the time will prefer bigger pick slots, keeping more product on the floor. The trade-off in this situation is selection travel. And if you recall, a little over half of your total direct labor spend is order selection. In order to quantify this trade-off and add a little bit more perspective to this, I'll use an example from a recent project. The operation in question was primarily using two different racking configurations, one small flow racks and one large pushback racks. The operators wanted to avoid replenishments and pallet putaways as much as possible, so they preferred the larger rack type. To illustrate the trade-off to them, we ran a simple scenario introducing an intermediate rack type. Sure, it increased replenishments for some items, but the trade-off in selection travel, a reduction of 4 full aisles, meant a little over $1 million a year in net savings. Now, moving on from racking to overall facility capacity, I'd like to explain the difference between total capacity and operating capacity. Total capacity is the total carrying capacity of the facility and current equipment configuration. Operating capacity, on the other hand, is the total productive carrying capacity of the facility. While the evaluation of available pallet positions is a common method of judging available capacity, it does miss one critical variable: vertical or cube capacity. And when it comes to reducing excess selection travel, this is a very important variable to consider. The typical operating capacity sweet spot is between 60 and 85%. When you start to eclipse the 85% mark, you're going to start noticing more space constraints, increased forklift cost, labor productivity declines, safety issues, additional product damage, and your ability to manage the peaks and lulls in volume will be reduced. On the other side of the spectrum, if your capacity utilization is low, and this is common in new facilities with a design year of 5 to 7 years in the future, if you're not working with your layout and material handling options, you're likely walking through a layout that is far too big and leaving a lot of efficiency on the table. A quick calculation that can be used to uncover your own operating capacity is dividing your total inventory in cubic feet by your total facility capacity, also in cubic feet, multiplied by 0.80. This will give you a rough estimate of how close you are to that threshold. Although this calculation is a good rough estimate, we do recommend going a bit more in-depth to also include other variables like void and usage allowances. When it comes to pick front utilization, The sweet spot is typically between 80 and 90%. Anything more than that, and you're likely going to see an increase in fingerprinting, put away, and replenishment labor. You're also going to start running out of flex room for ongoing slotting optimization and proper item sequencing. If you're below this range, unless your pick paths are planned appropriately, you risk increasing paid hours in the function that represents 50% of your direct labor, which again is order selection. You can roughly calculate your own front utilization percentage by dividing the current active items by your total available pick fronts. Keep in mind though, that like overall capacity utilization, this is a moving figure that needs to be monitored consistently. Now, going back to trade-offs, if you notice your front utilization is getting close to 90% mark, you may want to consider introducing smaller rack profiles for your slower moving items. You may see an increase in replenishment tasks, but you may be able to add to the lifetime of your facility. Conversely, if you find yourself on the lower end of the utilization range, you may consider utilizing tunnels where possible and planning pick paths to cut through unnecessary selection travel. As we move on to practices and processes, order selection methodology should be tied primarily to order size and item hit rate. Going back to our warehousing productivity study, it was noticed that zone and batch picking provided the highest order selection productivity. However, the most important thing here is context. We can use a few different examples here, but the most relevant one, especially during these times, is how operations are separating their e-commerce and retail areas. While discrete order selection, that is, one order at a time, may work for retail because of the larger order sizes, using the same methodology for e-commerce will throttle productivity and overall throughput capacity. These areas should be managed and picked separately whenever possible. Now, when it comes to evaluating productivity, whether it's receiving, order selection, or pallet consolidation on the dock, we recommend always using paid hours in addition to worked hours. Work productivity provides a good benchmark for evaluation throughout a given shift. However, when it comes to your bottom line, the full cost of the employee needs to be taken into account. To add a bit of context to this, the difference between worked productivity and paid productivity is about 20 to 30%. You can calculate this by simply dividing your total outbound volume in cases by your total paid hours directly from your payroll. After all, if cost per case is one of your most important metrics, if not the most important, productivity should be evaluated in a similar way. Now at this point, I would like to turn it over to Robbie to help us connect the dots.
Thanks, Hector. Although we've just gone through some fulfillment optimization tips and best practices that are sure to have a meaningful and immediate impact on your operations, should you choose to explore them further, it's important to remember that there are no silver bullets when it comes to improvement. The idea of fulfillment optimization is to add a fresh perspective on how the different areas of your operation connect and interact with one another. It's really about making the invisible visible. One of the biggest catalysts of positive change and optimization is how you leverage equipment and technology. One of the most important recommendations that we can make for those that are ready to start moving towards fulfillment optimization is to familiarize yourself with optimization systems. Just as management systems are commonplace today, so too will optimization systems be in the near future. To put it plainly, if you do not have one now, you will in the near future. So how are optimization systems different than your traditional management system? Well, they provide intelligence used to improve the operation. They do not replace the management system of today, but rather provide the base upon which these management systems operate. These optimization systems connect to your existing management systems and analyze operational data on a daily basis to provide recommendations for current and future layouts, current and future design, capacity utilization, existing material handling equipment, item slotting and sequencing, and labor requirements, among other things. For those who want to learn more about SKUstream, our fulfillment optimization system, check out our website at www.synccontext.com. So, whether you're a first mover looking to gain an edge on competition, or if it's just out of pure necessity like we've seen last year, there is a shift happening. If fulfillment optimization could be summed up in a single quote, it would be that the price of light is less than the cost of darkness. All right, before we open things up for questions and discussion through the chat feature, I'll provide a quick recap of the more important thoughts and takeaways from today's webinar. Despite management systems being widely adopted today, waste still exists. The problem is that operators aren't sure how much or where to find it. Management systems, by design, maintain the status quo. And if you're maintaining the status quo, not only are you not improving, you're likely declining. There is a big difference between data and intelligence, and it's not always obvious. While we did provide a few practical tips and insights throughout this webinar, there is no silver bullet to continuous improvement. There are a lot of variables that are involved. Fulfillment optimization is about connecting the dots and exploring the trade-offs. Introducing automation is a great way to improve productivity and efficiency, but it's not the only way. And finally, familiarize yourself with optimization systems. They are the new normal in warehousing technology. At this point, we would like to invite everyone to follow our page here on LinkedIn if you don't already. We're constantly updating our page with actionable content just like this, including our Fishbone Friday continuous improvement series, which you can also find on our blog at www.synccontext.com. Like always, if you enjoyed this webinar, leave a comment and let us know. We'll also hang around in the chat for the next 30 minutes, just in case there's any questions or discussion to be had. Thank you again.